Well, good morning, my friends. I am Pastor Michelle at Harmony Creek Church, and today is Sunday, March 1st, the second Sunday of Lent. And today I begin a 4-week sermon series on the book of Esther. And we will conclude this sermon series on Easter Sunday. And so I look forward to tying in this book with the resurrection of Jesus. So let's begin with this morning, though. This morning we're going to cover the first 2 chapters of Esther. And this is a good time to be talking about the book of Esther because our Jewish siblings are going to be celebrating Purim beginning tomorrow. And Purim is a joyous Jewish holiday celebrating the salvation of the Jewish people in ancient Persia. And you know that the hero of this story is Esther, of course. And Esther, and I would say her cousin Mordecai, also plays a role in securing salvation for their people. And so this, Purim is marked by themes of courage, divine reversal, community, and celebrations with masquerades, feasting, and charity. And so Purim is a really cool thing. And I heard from, I'm at my PFLAG meeting yesterday, there was a Jewish person that came, and she was just telling me about how many temples, have these extravagant celebrations and theater presentations, so to speak, play presentations of the story of Esther. So it's a really cool thing, Purim. So I want to point out, though, something about this book that many people may not always know. But Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't specifically mention God. God is never mentioned. God's not mentioned in prayer, in narration, in miracle. God's name is not uttered once. And for the Bible, for a book in the Bible, that seems pretty scandalous, right? Because the Bible is supposed to be about God. But this is a brilliant literary move by the anonymous writer, because we don't know who wrote Esther. Instead of telling us where God is, the author invites us to lean deeper, right? And it forces us to notice the subtle movements, the coincidences, the reversals, the strange timing of events, and invites us to find God for ourselves. It's as if the writer is whispering, look closer, my friends. Pay attention. God might not be named, but God is certainly not absent. That's an important thing to remember. God may not be named, but that does not mean God is absent. Esther is one of the most exciting and curious books in Scripture. The story unfolds more than 100 years after the Babylonian exile. Some Jewish people had returned to Jerusalem, but many remained scattered throughout the Persian Empire. And so our story of Esther takes place in Susa, the capital city of Persia. And the key characters are the 2 Jews who are living in exile, which is Esther and Mordecai. And then there is the Persian king. And then there's Haman, who comes in later in the story. Haman is the cunning villain whose pride threatens an entire people. And let's not forget Queen Vashti, who appears just in the beginning of our story, just in the beginning of Esther. And we're really going to only focus on chapters 1 through 2 today, because Esther is a 10-chapter book, and we're going to take this apart chapter by chapter each week. So in this first chapter of Esther, we find King Xerxes throwing a lavish party lasting several days, more than 180 days. That is a long party. This is an outrageous display of wealth and military might. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us Xerxes was he wanted to invade Greece, and he was promising rewards to those who would help him conquer Athens specifically. Well, conquer Athens, because that was the one territory that the king had not yet overtaken. So this feast was political theater. It was imperial propaganda. So on the final day of this really long party, this really long rager, while drunk on wine and ego, the king demands that Queen Vashti, his wife, appears before his guests in order to display her amazing beauty. Because we're told the 2 most beautiful women in the book of Esther is Queen Vashti and Esther. So the king wants Vashti to come and parade in front of his guests And he wants her to be wearing the royal crown. And my guess, and this is just my guess, is that she was summoned to be wearing only her crown. That's just my interpretation. But what does Vashti do? In this moment where this was probably unheard of in those days, Vashti stepped up and dared to say no to her husband, the king. In a world where women's voices were controlled, Vashti's refusal is radical because she risks everything. And guess what? She does lose everything as well. The king is furious with Vashti. His advisors panic and they work together with the king to craft a decree declaring that all women must obey their husbands and that every man shall rule his household. So the king responds to this one woman's no with deep insecurity and a lot of overreaction. And the holy irony of this story, which I love, is that the very system trying to secure male dominance will soon depend on a woman for survival. So let's remember that if it wasn't for Queen Vashti's no, we would never have gotten Esther's yes. So after Vashti is banished and perhaps even killed, some historians and commentators believe that Vashti was more than likely killed. The king, after Vashti's gone, the king decides to hold this 100-day, I think, or maybe year-long pageant to replace her. So into this absurd royal contest, which I picture as almost being like the show The Bachelor, into this mess steps Esther. And I want to point out that one big difference, because it probably wasn't exactly like The Bachelor. I don't think the king was handing out roses each week to different women. And also, and let's keep in mind that these women didn't exactly, probably more than likely, how many ways can I say that? These women didn't, not all of them probably auditioned for this role. Some of them were forced to go into this pageant and to enter this pageant. So into this mess, Esther, a young Jewish woman hiding her identity, she steps in. And Esther, and the king is just amazed by Esther's beauty. And the king declares that Esther will be the next queen, will be his wife, because he is just infatuated and he falls in love with Esther. Now, while all this is happening, Mordecai, after Esther wins the king's approval and she becomes queen, Mordecai is outside of the king's gate. He's outside of the gate, and he hears two eunuchs discussing a plot to assassinate the king, and reports it to Esther, and then Esther tells the king, and because of this exchange, the king's life is saved. And I want to point out just the justice part of it. It was two eunuchs, we are told, and eunuchs were treated like property just as much as the women were. And so maybe, not justifying that they wanted to kill, but they probably were just fed up with being used, and maybe they were being brave just like Vashti, and they were like, this is enough, enough's enough, let's just kill the king, so we're no longer being treated as property, as objects, so to speak. But that's just my possible interpretation of what was happening with these eunuchs and why they wanted to kill the king. But nonetheless, Mordecai, because of Mordecai reporting this to Esther and Esther reporting it to the king's life is saved. And that's going to come into play later in the story of Esther. And it's going to be very important for Mordecai. So we have this pattern that emerges, right? There's this pattern of hidden identity. Esther had to hide her identity as a Jewish person. There's quiet courage. She held quiet courage inside the empire. All of that echoes in unexpected places, this trend, this pattern. And so it brings me to the Disney movie Mulan. And Mulan is a film about a young Chinese woman who disguises herself as a man to take her elderly father's place in the imperial army. As she trains and struggles to prove herself, she's aided by the small dragon Mushu and eventually discovers her own strength and courage. When invading Huns threatened China, Mulan's intelligence and bravery saved the army and ultimately the emperor. So the story is about identity, honor, sacrifice, and becoming who you truly are. even when the world tells you who you're supposed to be. There's a quote in the movie Mulan says, "I know my place, and it is my duty to fight for the kingdom and protect the emperor." End quote. And I feel like this almost echoes the passage from Esther later on in chapter 4, where Mordecai reminds Esther of who she is. Mordecai tells Esther that she had come to her position for such a time as this. And certainly we can see that in the Disney movie, if you've seen it, Mulan comes to her position for such a time as this. She kind of writes herself into that story. Now, it's quite easy, I think, to see how Mulan and Esther connect, right? We have the hidden identities and fighting for their people. So one might wonder, how are we going to connect the writer Octavia E. Butler to all of this? So let's do that. Let's find out together, because that was my challenge for today, connecting all three of these women together, and even four, if we think about Queen Vashti, who is a very important character in the story of Esther. So thinking about Octavia E. Butler, she grew up in poverty, and she did not see herself reflected in the science fiction stories that she loved reading. And so what does she do? As she said once, she wrote herself in. She said, "I write myself in." She writes herself into the stories. So she enters this field dominated by white men. She collected several rejection letters through her years. She would work diligently and never gave up. She would wake at 2 a.m. to write her stories before going into her work, her day job, I guess. And eventually, after so many years of struggle, she became the first science fiction writer to earn and to receive the MacArthur Genius Grant. And so this is where I see, I'm not going to talk about it too long, but here's where I see the connection to Esther, to Queen Vashti, and to Esther and Mulan, and even Vashti. Like Esther, Butler lived within systems that were not built for her. And like Esther, she found a way in, right? Like Vashti, Butler refused to accept imposed limits, right? So she creates stories and becomes this genius writer. Like Mulan, Butler became what the world said she could not be. She became a famous writer in a field that was dominated by men. We think about all that, and I think sometimes courage looks dramatic. Sometimes courage looks quiet. Sometimes courage looks like saying no. And sometimes courage looks like hiding until the right moment to say yes. And perhaps, the deeper question, or even another question that we could think of this morning, is how do we, as God's people, how do we fit into God's story? Esther did not wake up one morning just knowing she was for such a time as this. I think that realization came later for her, when crisis demanded clarity. The book of Esther invites us to trust that even when God seems silent, God is still orchestrating redemption behind the scenes, redemption through God's people, redemption through every single one of us. And friends, maybe your story feels like Esther's. Maybe you're in a chapter of life where it doesn't feel like God is present. Maybe you're in a chapter of life where heaven feels quiet. Maybe you're in a stretch of time where you are not sure that God is even still speaking, or God is even listening. But what if the silence, my friends, is an invitation for us to look closer? Look at the people who just happen to show up in your life. Look at the doors that just happen to open. Look at the strength you just happen to find when you needed it most. Because what if God is still moving, but moving unnamed, but unmistakable? What if God is still speaking? Not always in thunder, but God is speaking through timing and courage and community. Maybe we won't always see it in the moment, but if we look closely enough at our own stories, we might begin to notice the providence of God, the reversals, the unexpected grace. God is still working. God is still working and speaking through the Vashtis who dare to say no. God is still speaking through the Esthers who dare to say yes. God is still speaking through the Mulans who dare to step forward. God is still speaking through the Octavia Butlers who dare to write themselves into the story. God is still speaking through every single one of us. That's how we're connected to God's story. That's how we're connected to, I think, these four people, including Vashti. Because in this very single moment, who you are right now, that is enough. We don't have to be anything other than who we are, and that is enough. And who we are is enough to make a difference, I believe. Even if it's a small difference, we have to start small. Because remember this, even when God is not named, God is not absent. God is still speaking. God is still moving. God is still redeeming this world through you, through me, through us. For such a time as this, we are made for such a time as this. Harmony Creek Church, we are made for such a time as this. And so God bless you, my friends, and may you never forget that you are made for such a time as this.